relationship was the fact that Svensson also respected Carlos. Svensson suddenly set down his knife and fork, dabbed at his mustache and lips with a serviette, stood and walked toward the door. He moved slowly, like a sloth, favoring his right leg, dragging it. He never offered an explanation for the leg. Svensson left the room without casting a single glance Carlos's way. Carlos waited a full minute in silence, knowing it would take Svensson all of that to walk down the hall. Finally he stood and followed, exiting into a long hall that led to the library, where he assumed Svensson had retired. He had met the Swiss 3 years ago while working with underground Russian factions determined to equalize the world's military powers through the threat of biological weapons. It was an old doctrine. What did it matter if the United States had 200,000 nuclear weapons trained on the rest of the world, if their enemies had the right biological weapons? A highly infectious airborne virus on the wind was virtually indefensible in open cities. One weapon to bring the world to its knees. Carlos paused at the library door, then pushed it open. Svensson stood by the glass wall overlooking the white laboratory 1 floor below. He'd lit a cigar and was engulfed in a cloud of hazy smoke. Carlos walked past a wall filled with leather-bound books, lifted a decanter of scotch, poured himself a drink, and sat on a tall stool. The threat of biological weapons could easily equal the threat of nuclear weapons. They could be easier to use, could be far more devastating. Could. In traditional contempt of any treaty, the USSR had employed thousands of scientists to develop biological weapons, even after signing the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention in 1972. All supposedly for defense purposes, of course. Both Svensson and Carlos were intimately familiar with the successes and failures of former Soviet research. In the final analysis, the so-called superbugs they had developed weren't super enough, not even close. They were far too messy, too unpredictable, and too easy to neutralize. Svensson's objective was simple: to develop a highly virulent and stable airborne virus with a 3 to 6 week incubation period that responded immediately to an antivirus he alone controlled. The point wasn't to kill off whole populations of people. The point was to infect whole regions of the Earth within a few short weeks and then control the only treatment. This was how Svensson planned to wield unthinkable power without the help of a single soldier. And this was how Carlos Massyrian would rid the world of Israel, without firing a single shot, assuming, of course, such a virus could be developed and then secured. But then all scientists knew it was only a matter of time. Svensson stared at the lab below. The Swiss warrior's hair parted down the middle so that black locks flopped either way. In his black jacket, he looked like a bat. He was a man married to a dark religious code that required long trips in the deepest of nights. Carlos was certain his God dressed in a black cloak and fed on misery, and at times he questioned his own allegiance to Svensson. The man was driven by an insatiable thirst for power, and the men he worked for, even more so. This was their food, their drug. Carlos didn't care to understand the depths of their madness. He only knew they were the kind of people who would get what they wanted, and in the process he would get what he wanted: the restoration of Islam. He took a sip of the scotch. You would think that just one of the thousands of scientists working in the defensive biotechnological sector would have stumbled onto something meaningful after all these years. They had over 300 paid informants in every major pharmaceutical company. Carlos had interviewed 57 scientists from the former Soviet bioweapons program quite persuasively, and in the end, nothing. At least, nothing they were looking for. The telephone on the large black sandalwood desk to their right rang shrilly. Neither made a move for the phone. It stopped ringing. "We need you in Bangkok," Svensson said. His voice sounded like the rumble of an engine churning through a cylinder full of gravel. "Bangkok?" "Yes. Bangkok. Raison Pharmaceutical." "The Raison vaccine," Carlos said. They had been following the development of the vaccine for over a year with the help of an informant in the Raison labs. He'd always thought it would be ironic if the French company Raison, pronounced raison, meaning reason, might one day produce a virus that would bring the world to its knees. "I wasn't aware the vaccine held any promise for us," he said. Svensson limped slowly, so slowly, to his desk, picked up a piece of white paper and scanned it. You remember a report 3 months ago about unsustainable mutations of the vaccine. Our contact said the mutations were unsustainable and died out in minutes." Carlos wasn't a scientist, but he knew more than the average man about bioweapons, naturally. "Those were the conclusions of Monique de Raison. Now we have another report. A man at the CDC received a nervous visitor today who claimed that the mutations of the Raison vaccine held together under prolonged specific heat. The result, the visitor claimed, would be a lethal airborne virus with an incubation of 3 weeks, one that could infect the entire world's population in less than 3 weeks. And how did this visitor happen to come across this information? Svensson hesitated. "A dream," he said. "A very unusual dream. A very, very convincing dream of another world in which the people think his dreams of this world are only that, dreams." Now it was Carlos's turn to hesitate. "Another world?" he said slowly. "We have our reasons for paying attention. I want you to fly to Bangkok and interview Monique de Raison. If the situation warrants, I will want the Raison vaccine itself, by whatever means." Now we're resorting to mystics? Svensson had covered the CDC well, with 4 on the payroll, if Carlos remembered correctly. Even the most innocuous-sounding reports of infectious diseases quickly made their way to the headquarters in Atlanta. Svensson was understandably interested in any report of any new outbreak and the plans to deal with it. But a dream? Thoroughly out of character for the stoic, black-hearted Swiss. This alone gave the suggestion its only credence. Svensson glared at him with dark eyes. "As I said, we have other reasons to believe this man may know things he has no business knowing, regardless of how he attained that information. Such as, it's beyond you. Suffice it to say, there is no way Thomas Hunter could have known that the Raison vaccine was subject to unsustainable mutations." Carlos frowned. "A coincidence?" "I'm not willing to take that chance. The fate of the world rests on one elusive virus and its cure. We may have just found that virus." "I'm not sure Monique de Raison will offer an interview." "Then take her by force." "And what about Hunter?" "You will learn by whatever means necessary everything Thomas Hunter knows, and then you will kill him." One. It all started one day earlier with a single silenced bullet out of nowhere. Thomas Hunter was walking down the same dimly lit alley he always took on his way home, after locking up the small Java hut on Colfax and 9th, when a smack punctuated the hum of distant traffic. Red brick dribbled from a 1-inch hole 2 feet away from his face. He stopped mid-stride. Smack! This time he saw the bullet plow into the brick. This time he felt the sting on his cheek as tiny bits of shattered brick burst from the impact. This time every muscle in his body seized. Someone had just shot at him. Was shooting at him. Tom recoiled to a crouch and instinctively spread his arms. He couldn't seem to tear his eyes off those 2 holes in the brick, dead ahead. There had to be some mistake. Figments of his overactive imagination, his aspirations to write novels, had finally ruptured the line between fantasy and reality with these 2 empty eye sockets staring at him from the red brick. "Thomas Hunter!" That wasn't his imagination, was it? No, that was his name. And it was echoing down the alley. A 3rd bullet crashed into the brick wall. He bolted to his left, still crouching. 1 long step, drop the right shoulder, roll. Again the air split above his head. The bullet clanged into a steel ladder and rang down the alley. Tom came to his feet and chased the sound in a full sprint, pushed by instinct as much by terror. He'd been here before, in the back alleys of Manila. He'd been a teenager then, and the Filipino gangs were armed with knives and machetes rather than guns. But at the moment